So welcome, our beloved colleague Riaz. I so appreciate your consistent leadership. And as always at Setsi, we begin all things by acknowledging our creator, by acknowledging our ancestors, by acknowledging the original stewards of the various lands we're on. We acknowledge all those who toiled without compassion or compensation. We acknowledge all our elders and community stalwarts whose shoulders we stand on as we build, share, and learn together for our collective liberation and sovereignty. So Riaz, please share a bit about your remarkable work and your background with our listeners and viewers.
Well, I'm not sure it's remarkable, but I'll take a shot at it. Thanks so much, Victor. And listen, happy New Year to you, the listeners, viewers. Such a pleasure to be here with you. And I've been a long-time admirer of Setsi and the work that you folks are doing in building a community around equity and anti-racism and really just try to create that sense of purpose and community. So I just wanted to say thanks for that. And I should say, to start in a good way, like you did with the ancestral land acknowledgement, I'm joining from the Algonquin and Anishinaabe unceded territory, and just really grateful to be on this land and thankful for all the caretakers that have been here before me. Like I said, I'm not sure the work is remarkable, but I will leave that to be judged by others. But I will say, if it's ever been or will be deemed remarkable, it's certainly because I stand on the shoulders of great giants. The communities that have shown me the way, the folks that I've been able to work with, and certainly the leaders and people in positions of power and privilege who have listened and learned and then acted on what they heard. And I think that that's probably the most important piece of the work that we need to do, is sort of educate, create awareness, and build that momentum for a community to make an impact. Before starting into any of the work stuff, what I will say is my most remarkable and most important work is being a husband and father. I have a 2-year-old. She turned 2 in August. She is certainly my North Star, my guiding light. She has me wrapped around her finger, Victor. I gotta tell you, there's nothing this girl will do or say that will ever make me feel any differently. And so just, I get out of bed, as I'm sure you do with your 4 children, doing this work in a good way so that we can sort of pave the way for the next generation that comes after us. For me, it's really important to kind of understand where you are and where you were, and then like that sort of helping you guide yourself into the next sort of phase or what we're doing in our lives. And so, kind of before getting into the work that I do, it's kind of important for me to say, like when I was born, when I was raised, when I was growing up as an adolescent, none of this equity stuff really was clearly articulated in society. It was sort of nascent. It was sort of under the radar. It was important, but I don't think me as a person who grew up in Canada or was born in Canada felt a certain light towards it, if I can put it that way. That all changed though. So I grew up, born and raised in Canada. I was called a coconut my whole life, brown on the outside, white on the inside, playing hockey, very proud of the fact I didn't have an accent. My friends used to make fun of my father's accent, and it was all fine. It sort of, water off a duck's back. And then that changed in 2001. So shortly after 9/11, I was at university for my first year. I was, I think it was about 10 days after 9/11, I was walking back home in a very small rural Ontario town where I was going to university. And I was walking up the hill back to my student residence after a kind of late evening meeting. And out of nowhere, on my left, somebody came out of a driveway and said, "You effing terrorists, go back home." And I thought, they can't possibly be talking to me. There's no way. I was born and raised in Vancouver. That this has got to be someone else they're talking to. So I look over to my left and I see a brick just hurling towards my head. And I ducked, the brick hit the ground, and I took off running as fast as I possibly could. I think it was in that moment that my perspective changed. To that person, I was an outsider. I didn't belong in Canada. I didn't belong in this community. I didn't belong in the society. I needed to go back to where I was from. And I think from that point forward, I couldn't stop seeing the injustices every single day. And so it was kind of a light switch for me that triggered something much bigger and grander than that one event that happened in 2001. It actually kind of changed the course of what I wanted to do with my career and what I wanted to do with my life and the kind of volunteer work or the work that I do with communities. So that kind of leads me to where I am today, which is the Vice President in Policy at Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, CMHC for those in the know with the acronym. And so I've had a chance to lead social policy, equitable housing outcomes, belatedly also policy measurement and analysis, as well as our horizontal policy work. And a lot of the work that we're doing is focused on equitable housing outcomes for those communities that have been equity denied for so long, based on the injustices, based on the paradigm of our society, which is built on sort of keeping folks down and making sure that there is a distance between power and privilege and those that didn't come from it. And so we're really focusing on doing that through kind of 4 major themes. One is around data and research, making sure we have the right analytical methodologies to be able to show the data, to put forward good policy and process work. The second is really taking a very keen stance on making sure that any of the policies, programs, and processes at CMHC or promulgated by CMHC are equity driven the best that they possibly can be. The third, which is probably the most important, is centering lived and living experience from communities and doing that not in a performative way, which is very easy to do, as sort of a helicopter consulting, but doing it in a really meaningful way that engages communities, listens, accepts the feedback, and then returns back with some of that feedback in a way that says, this is what we heard. Does that make sense? Is that what you were trying to say? We want to make sure we get that right, and doing that kind of consistently, which is difficult, but really the most important part of it. And then finally, trying to enact a bit of a culture change at CMHC as an organization, which is a crown corporation in and of itself, a colonial institution. How do we put in place the right cultural constructs so that our employees and our staff and our executives all feel enabled to do this work in a really good and important and meaningful way? Before that, and we were just talking before we started here today, I also was leading the Employment Equity Act review on behalf of government. And there was a task force put in place. And I know you recently interviewed Marie Clark Walker, who was one of the members of the task force. That was really meaningful work. As you could probably imagine, Victor, just two important things came out of that. Many things came out of that, but two things that really stuck out to me were that Black and 2S LGBTQIA+ communities and Canadians would be recognized as distinct employment equity groups, which I think is long overdue and certainly work that the government should continue to advance. And just really proud of that work and the work that the task force put together. And then finally, just outside of work, I get to sit on this board of directors for a 100-year-old nonprofit called Christie Lake Kids, which is focused on providing free sports, recreation, and arts programming for low-income youth and kids in Ottawa. And so I'm not going to be shameless enough to plug donations for that group, but I'll just put that out there into the ether and see what happens. ChristieLakeKids.com. Anyways, there you go. So I'll leave it there for that first question.
That's incredible. That provides so much context around what shapes your analysis and obviously what drives you in terms of the social justice policy work that you're doing. And once again, I really appreciate your candor and vulnerability. As you know, I have 2 daughters as well. They're also my why, my reason for waking up. So I'm grateful for you sharing all that with us. And for once again, your visionary leadership and your consistent commitment to community economic development. So once again, I greatly appreciate you. So that leads us to our next question, which is a simple question, but an important one. What's inspiring you right now? Like we're living in a time where we have intersectional crises and so many challenges that are pervasive and very complex. What's inspiring you right now? What has you curious?
Well, what's inspiring to me is both the daunting nature of the crises that you've mentioned, but also the fact that with that kind of gravity and weight comes a great responsibility, and that inspires me. And it takes an accountability for all of us in society, civil society, nonprofits, government, activists, everyone to come together and kind of create those or find those innovative solutions. And for me, like the thing that kind of gets me out of it is housing is much more than just 4 walls. It's a place to grow from. It's safety, it's security, it's education, it's health, it's everything, it's family. And so I feel very blessed to be entrusted with trying to identify some of the barriers that exist within the housing space, especially for equity denied communities. We need to build housing at an unprecedented rate in Canada. Like we need 3.5 million more homes by 2030, more than we would build anyways, just to restore some balance of affordability in this country. That is an enormous task. And it is daunting, as I said, but I think that level of depth also gets me really inspired, and I'm cautiously optimistic about the future, as I tend to be about most things. But there's a lot of things that we need to deal with. We need to deal with the fact that low and middle income Canadians don't have options for housing. And so what do we do for workers, for families, for seniors, for students, for refugees, for asylum seekers? What do we do for people transitioning into or out of homelessness? What supports can we put in place to remediate those barriers that they're experiencing? And then finally, we have chronic homelessness that exists across Canada. And so we need to find options and opportunities to lift people up and find those spaces, both physically, but also for emotional supports, so that they can have a home that they can be in and grow from. And I think what's been inspiring to me recently is some of the changes that we've been able to enact, within some of the policy work of the government. I think you'll see the removal of the federal sales tax on apartment construction, which I think is huge. It'll start to unlock some significant home building. We've got the recapitalization of the Canada Mortgage Bond. We've got the work that came out of the fall economic statement. There was $15 billion for apartment loan construction. There was $1 billion for low-income and vulnerable Canadians. So I think we're making some small but meaningful steps. I think there's much more that we can do. But I think these small wins continue to get me out of bed. It's not like we're going backwards, or at least we're moving in the right direction, and we're going to make those small steps towards a solution. And I'm also really just inspired by the people that I get to work with, to be honest, like Victor, yourself, with the communities that I work with, and certainly the people at CMHC that really are incredible. They're doing some really amazing research. For example, there's a project called Buying While Black, looking to figure out what are the barriers for Black Canadians in trying to purchase homes, identifying those and trying to remediate them within a policy structure so that we don't continue to replicate those over and over and over. We also have this really cool kind of program at CMHC called Solutions Labs. So it's about taking community-centric visions and views and creating solutions for problems that are kind of existential and challenging and really hairy and wicked and complex. And so the one that comes to mind for me is the Hogan's Alley Solutions Lab, which is looking at displacement of Black communities, historic and current. And I have to say, CMHC was involved in displacement of Hogan's Alley, residents, and it's part of this resolution we need to come to. And I think this is an act of sort of atonement, if I can put it that way, for those actions. It's a small, step in the right direction, but I think it's part of the truth telling that we need to have to be able to have the real, honest, transparent, genuine, meaningful conversation to continue to have this impact we want to have. So that's a lot there, but that's what inspires me.
No, once again, I appreciate your candor and even the concept of restitution and atonement that's needed. When we're dealing with colonial constructs, sometimes there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and system change and system transformation, although incremental, requires leaders like yourself. Myself and Isaac from Dream Legacy Foundation talk all the time about the affordable housing issue, especially its disproportionate impacts on very specific equity denied groups. So once again, I applaud your leadership and your consistent push in terms of not just policy, but practical models that, once again, sometimes may seem incremental, but the fact remains we're moving in the right direction. So once again, I give thanks for your leadership. So my next question, what challenges and barriers do you face in your work, and how are you and your team working to overcome them?
The barriers are plentiful, Victor. Plentiful, I think that would be the mild statement. I had mentioned the 3.5 million homes that CMHC estimates we need to have built above and beyond what we'd already normally do by 2030. I mean, that's massive. That's a barrier in and of itself. And I think it's clear that there is no government or set of governments that together can buy itself out of this crisis. I think that this requires an all hands on deck approach, civil society, not for profit. It needs the private sector investment. It needs academics. It needs anyone with a good idea to come forward and get their hand up in the air and say, listen, we have an idea here that we need to start to push and think through. And I think that's the barrier that exists, but I think there is a way for us to create a platform to have those discussions and have those engagements to ensure that we're taking the best ideas forward, so that we can break down the challenge that's in front of us. And I heard many times in the equity work is you don't eat an elephant all at once. You've got to take little bites and chunks out of the elephant. And I think that's what we need right now. We need incremental change, but sustainable change. And that's something that's going to make a difference for the future. Some of the challenges that come across for me are the stats are really clearly identifying that equity denied communities continue to feel and face barriers in housing. I'll rhyme off some stats I had written down here. The NHS priority groups, the persons with disabilities, newcomers, Indigenous Canadians, racialized Canadians have the highest incidence of core housing need. That is pretty stark. Indigenous, Black Canadians, Latin American Canadians, Arab Canadians have lower levels of home ownership than the national average. And what this creates is not just a current issue, it creates an intergenerational wealth issue and disparities that will continue to just replicate themselves into the future. That's a socioeconomic issue. That's based on housing, but it's a socioeconomic issue that we deal with. There's poverty rates that are much higher for racialized Canadians, Black Canadians, as well as Indigenous Canadians. We've got less than 1% of rental units that are affordable in a lot of urban centers that are affordable to the lowest income Canadians. Less than 1%. That is a stark figure for me. That's something that we need to build more, but we also need to create the wraparound supports and services so that people feel like they're safe, in their home that they're able to occupy. And the final stat that comes up to me that I have written down, which is really mind-boggling, is that we have the lowest vacancy rate in 22 years. We're down to 1.9%, which means that it creates competition in the marketplace. And the people who are most impacted by the competition in the marketplace are lower income equity denied communities. And so these are just layers of marginalization that have been created by a system that we need to find our way out of. And I think the way to do that is that sort of all hands on deck approach that I was referring to just a few minutes ago.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I was speaking to my colleague, Lisa Arneson, the founder of the Ashe Foundation for Black Communities with Disabilities. And when you think about the intersectional realities of some of these equity denied groups, it's astounding. But once again, there's a lot of impressive work. I mean, Minister Sean Fraser is doing some remarkable work in terms of trying his best to find ways and means, not just to honor the mandate letters and his mandates, but also coming up with solution labs and models and frameworks and housing strategies that impact us coast to coast to coast. So once again, systemic transformation is incremental with folks like yourself. Within CMHC, I'm honored to have the conversation, but more importantly, I'm optimistic. So that leads me to my next question. How do you feel about the future of this ecosystem? How do you feel about the future of CMHC as a Crown Corp? How do you feel about the future of affordable housing in Canada?
That's a big question. That's a really big question. I would say, as I said before, I'm cautiously optimistic. That's just who I am as a person. So I think that while the problem is daunting, while it's heavy, we have seen some improvement. And I think that that's the word I would use. It's not there's no game changers, but I think we're moving in the right direction. And Ray Williams always talks about these wicked problems. Housing is a wicked problem. Affordable housing is a wicked problem. And he's right about that. A wicked problem also needs a wicked solution, which means it's probably hadn't been thought of yet. It needs something innovative. It needs something avant-garde. It needs something to be outside of the box, if I could be so cliched, so that we can create some sort of change that's new and different, and then making sure that that's sustainable and, as I mentioned, sort of replicable over time. And I think that's the only way to get us out of the sort of challenge that we face today. So I'm cautiously optimistic about the work that we're doing, and humbled by the nature of the work we have to do because it's so meaningful and heavy, and it affects people from coast to coast to coast in terms of the roof over their head, which I take great responsibility for. What I would say is, in terms of the work that we need to do, there's sort of a multi-pronged attack I think we need. One is we have to make the math work for home builders. If the math doesn't work, especially in this current environment, higher interest rates, inflation is up, people are not going to build. And so we need to create the ecosystem or the winning conditions for home builders to want to build. And so that's a key kind of strategic imperative that we need to build into the system. We also need to think about how are we building communities, and can we change the way we build communities so that they're different, more inclusive, more equitable. That launches into, we need to be more innovative and strategic about how we use modular housing, panelization. We need to think about kind of the industrial aspect of housing. Housing really hasn't changed in 50 years, or even longer potentially. We build houses the same way we always have, but is there ways that we can sort of introduce new technologies or mechanisms to build faster and at scale? And can we invest in those companies who do that, as a country? The other is that we're at the lower end of the G7 and the OECD in terms of our community housing in Canada when compared to sort of just market housing. So how do we grow that part of the housing continuum so that there are more options for vulnerable and lower income Canadians? So I think that's certainly something that we're also really concentrating our efforts on. The most vulnerable, people who are homeless, absolutely need better supports. There's encampments that are going up across the country. Like this is a serious problem for those who are in greatest need. So that can't be left off the discussion and the equation. It's an absolutely critical component of it. And then finally, we also need to ensure that people in this current economic environment can stay in their homes that they're actually already in. So we need to make the math work, not just for home builders, but also people who are homeowners. And I think these are kind of like six juggling like balls that you have to juggle at the same time without dropping them, because the problem is so complex and wicked, as Ray would say.
I love Elder Ray. so I give thanks for the plug and for his incredible work. I think he's going to be doing more work now that he's retired than
Yes.
ever, in terms of just...
He'll be busier, probably.
Yeah, 100%. His mind is incredible. and his diligence and tenacity and commitment to our people is remarkable. So my second last question, what is your ultimate goal and what does success look like and feel like to you and your colleagues?
Well, it's CMHC has an aspiration, which is that by 2030, everyone can afford the home that they're in and it meets their needs. So I think for me, success would be that everyone has a home that they can afford. It meets their needs for themselves and their families. To get there, that's a lofty goal and aspiration, to be perfectly frank. But I think it gets a lot of people out of bed every morning. Not just at CMHC, but I think the government of Canada, I think that there are people who are in the not-for-profit, civil society organizations, yourselves. I think this is the kind of time where all of us can band together and come up with, a solution to this wicked problem. In terms of, there are two other things that I would maybe want to say, and there's an important aspect here where we need to continue to center lived and living experience in our work. One way we tried to do that recently is through some improvements to the Affordable Housing Fund and the Apartment Construction Loan Program, which were previously known as the National Housing Co-Investment Fund and the Metro Construction Financing Initiative. And to really put kind of money where your mouth is, my team hosted a roundtable with Black finance and community leaders to understand the barriers that exist for these programs and how communities could access them. I think that for me was a really eye-opening experience because it was different than things we had heard from, in the past through other consultation mechanisms. And it's usually the usual suspects that get consulted or engaged. And so try to break the mold and create a new space and a new forum to engage with Black community and finance leaders to understand from their perspective what was not working in the programs. And I think that it was eye-opening and meaningful for me to be able to incorporate some of that thinking into some of our policy work.
That's incredible. It's incredible. So my last question, do you have any closing thoughts or calls to action for our listeners and our viewers?
Really just let's all get together and get this thing done would be my call to action. The other thing I would say is that, and I've said this about anti-racism and equity work, it's not on one person's shoulder or one group's shoulder to push this really big rock up the ever steepening hill. It's on all of us. We all need to come together, really come up with those solutions that are grounded in reality and not just sort of thought through in the ivory tower or the academic textbooks. It needs to be grounded in reality and what's happening today. And so sort of the call to action is just let's get everyone together and keep the conversation alive and be vocal. And I trust that the bravery of people who put their hand up and say something meaningful will be noticed and welcomed, not just by me, but all other actors who are in the housing space. So I think that would be my call to action.
Shay, I couldn't agree more. A lot of these pervasive problems, it's not a how. We know how to solve these problems. So who and where? Who are the thought leaders and practitioners that we need to convene and build and collaborate with? And where are the communities of practice or the models that can be replicated? You spoke about prefab, modular homes. There's folks on the ground doing the work. We need them to come together. I couldn't agree more. So as always at Setsi, we end the way we began this interview by acknowledging our creator, by acknowledging the original stewards of the various lands we're on, by acknowledging our ancestors, by acknowledging all those who toiled without compassion or compensation. We acknowledge all our elders and community stalwarts whose shoulders we stand on as we build, share, and learn together for our collective liberation and sovereignty. Thank you so much, Riaz, for all that you do for so many. We appreciate your visionary leadership.
My pleasure.